Greetings from the cosmic horrors. The stars are right once again, and the great old ones shall allow us to talk about for 30 minutes H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer who's a genre unto himself. I'm your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executive of the Lovecraft estate on Yawgoth, joined in by two from Material World, David Guffey, a professor at Mispatock University who survived a Christmas shopping trip at Kingsport, and Richard Wilson, who's been eavesdropping on Lovecraft for ages now. H.P. Lovecraft started writing fiction around the age of 7. His first story was titled Noble Eavesdropper, which in his own words concerned a boy who overheard some horrible conclave of subterraneous beings in a cave. Though in another account he wrote about it as being about a cave of robbers. Lovecraftian scholars S.T. Josie and David E. Schultz theorized the story may have been inspired by Arabian Nights with its many mentions of caves. We don't know exactly because Noble Eavesdropper is now lost. His first surviving fiction is a work he produced around the age of 8, Little Glass Bottle, probably inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's short story Manuscript Found in a Bottle. A captain of a catboat named William Jones, which was also the name of the 8th governor of Rhode Island, finds a bottle floating in the ocean, inside of messages dated from 1864. The author of the message is John Jones, who we presume is of no relation to the captain or of the Martian Manhunter. Stating that his ship full of treasure is sinking fast, and on the back side is a map showing the spot where the ship has sunk, which is near Australia and not too far from where Cthulhu lies. The captain charters a schooner and 4 weeks later arrives at the spot in question. Divers find an iron bottle. The message inside reads, "Dear searcher, excuse me for the practical joke I played on you, but it serves you right to know nothing, to find nothing for your foolish act." Captain Jones isn't pleased by this prank, but learns further in the note that $250 or maybe $25, depending on how you interpret the decimal point in the manuscript, was left in a bottle at the bottom of the ocean as well. It defrayed their expenses, the final line goes, but I hardly think they will ever go to a mysterious place that's directed by a mysterious bottle. Lovecraft called it a juvenile attempt at humor. No great work of art, Ellis Frank DeCam wrote in his biography of the author. The story shows by his mere existence that his youthful author was already appreciating himself to the storytelling's trade. Keeping in mind that it was written by an 8-year-old, I found the story to be amusingly well written. I can imagine Lovecraft's grandfather genuinely praising him for such a tale and posting it on the family icebox. David, Richard, the Lovecraftian word of the month is Lovecraftian. Believe it or not, the author coined the word himself. Today, we use it to describe his type of horror writing, but Lovecraft used it to mean something else. What did he mean by Lovecraftian?
I would, if I had to take a guess, I'd say as far as they used for to describe, say again, a horror of some form that is difficult to describe, or outside the bounds of human knowledge and that type of thing, as far as different, impossible to categorize.
Any guesses, David?
That's a pretty good one, but it might also have something to do with his style of writing, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Lovecraft used it as a heading for a one-time column in the April 1921 issue of the United Cooperative, an amateur journal he co-edited, which he titled Lubrications Lovecraftian, referring to that he'd given a deep thoughts on the following subjects. And in this diatribe, he complained about how if the Irish were allowed to have their own republic, they'd bring doom to the civilized world. Also, he complained about people who opposed America entering the Great War and those who dared to criticize him. So Lovecraftian meant that he was giving deep thought into something. He loved.
Okay.
That's quite a bit different from the way that it's bandied about today, which basically anything involving tentacles seems to be then described as Lovecraftian, regardless of what context it's being used in.
Or anything that's just so weirdly off the beaten path that it's not really applicable to anything else, any other kind of
doesn't quite check all the boxes.
Right.
Yeah, he gave it a very different meaning back then. He loved turning people's names into adjective. When commenting about Frank Belknap Long's writing, he mentioned that in defense of Belknapian metaphor, for Samuel Loveman, there was the Lovematic defense, which sounds like a movie you'd used in singles bars back in the 70s. And when he went to go see Maurice Moe, He called it a Mocratic visit. After learning that Farnsworth Wright, editor of Weird Tales, had rejected a story by Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft hoped the editor would change his mind in typical Wrightian fashion. When describing Robert Barlow's cat, he called it a Barlovian felidae. For Robert Bloch, Lovecraft described his body of work as Blockanania, which could be mistaken for a dance craze. He had the most fun with Clark Ashton Smith, coining Clark Ashton-esque things and Clark Ashtonic, even adding a religious title, Clark Ashtatana and Clark Ashtatanana. Cthulhu even receives the same treatment when he wrote about Cthulian relative or Cthulhu gratitude. The usage for Lovecraft to describe a horror story is thought to have been first done by August Derleth, probably in the 1940s. The earliest usage I can find from it of this usage would be from L. Sprang to Cam in 1953 when he described Shug Nograth as a Lovecraftian version of Pan. And I've actually seen another version of Lovecraftian pop up recently. Do you have any idea what that might mean?
No.
It's real obvious once you think about it, but it's used to describe a fan of Lovecraft.
Okay, that's self-referential there.
Yeah, I first noticed it when I was reading the book Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge, but it showed up again in Publishers Weekly when they were talking about the new edition of Shadow of Time was coming out, and stating it would be held by Lovecraftians. And
Okay.
yes, and there's also non-Lovecraftian. I've seen this word pop up, and this meaning is usually applied to people like his successors, like August Derleth, Ramsey Campbell, or a modern writer like Neil Gaiman in his Cthulhu stories. Though to me, that would seem to be Lovecraftian. It's almost like they're saying that non-Lovecraftian means a Lovecraftian story not written by Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it. Well, definitely.
Yeah. It's also popped up to describe Richard Chambers, whose horror stories slightly predate Lovecraft. His King in Yellow was published 5 years when Lovecraft was 5 years old. I think Lovecraftian should mean something that's purposely separated from the cosmic horror author. Kind of like Jeff Vandermeer, author of Annihilation. He might describe himself as a non-Lovecraftian because he resents being compared to the late author and describes his fans as cult members. So,
okay.
Yeah. All right. Next topic for our discussion is the elder god of the month is Azathoth. So what do y'all know about him?
Well, he's kind of the big boss, really, I guess, of the old ones, as far as when they showed the family tree of who all the various entities had descended from, and he was up at the top of the tree. So as far as his place in the hierarchy was concerned. Well, I think what I liked about him that kind of separated him from some of the others is that you think of Cthulhu, as far as there's various characteristics, the tentacles and the wings and that kind of thing. But with Azathoth, it seemed as though he was perpetually shifting and everyone's description of him was different and that type of thing, almost as though, again, he was kind of beyond the human's ability to comprehend correctly and that everyone was seeing him, perceiving him somehow in a different shape.
So is he is that the one that is also the blind idiot god at the center of the universe playing the pan flute or whatever? So
yeah,
definitely you're gonna have an amorphous blob with eyeballs and tentacles and pseudopods and all that stuff. So
of his 100 nicknames, I liked the nuclear chaos. It's one of the best ones that I saw him described.
Okay, well, does it also go by the crawling chaos? Or is that something different?
I think that one's something different.
Okay.
Sometimes they kind of run together.
Yeah.
But being called the blind idiot god doesn't sound all that bad. It seems like just be a bumbling deity. You just stand still. He would bypass you and not even notice you at all, or just step out of his way. And I'm guessing the blind and idiot part, mean that he has a different level of understanding. That he's like, we are beneath his notice, basically.
Right. Yeah. That we're all just insects to him.
Yeah. And according to Lovecraft's genealogy, Cthulhu is Azathoth's great great grandson. Yes, and he's described quite lengthily in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadeth. which goes like outside the order universe with no dreams reach, the last amorphous blight of neithermost confusion, which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. The boundless demon Sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud, who gnaws hungrily in inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond the time amidst the muffled, maddening beating of bowed drums and 10 monotonous whine of accursed flutes. Of course, I just uttered his name aloud, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's going to go badly for you.
Yeah.
Hate to be you. Sucks, though.
This may be my last podcast. You have to carry on without me.
Could be.
Yeah, he gets mentioned by name only in Whisper in Darkness, Dreams in the Witch House, Thing on the Doorstep, Haunter of the Dark. He did attempt to write a novel in 1922 called Azathoth, but he only wrote about 480 words before stopping and never returning.
Was that meant to reference the book of Azathoth, the one that's from Dreams in the Witch House, where the people were signing it in blood and whatnot? Was that meant to be kind of, this is what the content of that book would be?
It's possible it could have. He was like, it didn't go far enough to like really, tell you much. It seemed like an interesting premise, but it was like you don't really know much about it. And there are at least 3 death metal bands that call themselves Azathoth. So, there's something about Lovecraft.
Establish a copyright there.
Yeah, there's something about Lovecraft and death metal, that is like, there's like, you'll find tons of death metal bands that have like some type of, Lovecraftian.
You've got the great old ones. There's Nyarlathotep. There's other ones that basically every track is some kind of reference to a Lovecraft story or a Lovecraft character, that type of thing. As far that's really become its own subgenre, of metal as far as that goes. Lovecraftian, there's another, use of Lovecraftian, whether Lovecraftian metal.
Yes, the definition for death metal. Yeah, but it's a lot of times been really obscure references. Like they'll mention some name that's only got mentioned once in some story, like very deep into there. They'll pick that out and name their band after them. There's actually a band named Blind Idiot God, and they're an instrumental rock trio from St. Louis, formed in 1982 and still together. So.
Oh wow, okay, that's it's then they no posers there. They were certainly ahead of the curve in terms of their Lovecraft interest, much like Metallica and that type of thing, where they were kind of precursors of kind of the first some of the first metal acts and that type of thing to reference Lovecraft work. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so they're still together too. At least I think they are.
Yeah, they might be.
I haven't kept up with Metallica in quite some time, I have to say. Yeah, and Richard, have you picked up the latest issue of Miss Metonic?
Yes, I did. I think that was a kind of an improvement over the second one. It didn't seem as though the references were being thrown out there just to see who would spot, what story it was a reference to. It does still seem to me, I guess, as far as it'd be good to know whether this is a mini series, and that would kind of explain why the pace seems to be going so quickly, versus if it was intended to get to run for longer than that. Because it seemed as though this most recent one, they picked 3 stories with a Reanimator, Dunwich Horror, and with the Thing on the Doorstep, and kind of just stuck with influences from the 3 of them versus just let's throw everything Lovecraft related at the wall and see what sticks. But it'd be handy to know as far as how he's planning on pacing it out. If it's a 6 or 8 issues or something like that, that would explain why it seems to be in such a rush to get all these references in and have all these characters pop in and say hello and whatnot. So
there was one thing that really struck out to me. It kind of like it seemed like a really odd thing, the way they phrased it. At one point, Herbert West states, I have you know that I'm a war hero. And Tom answers, Canadian, I'm Irish.
I saw that as well. Yeah. And then they just go onward, and I'm like, I don't understand what he's talking about there.
I had to look that up.
Like a slur or something along those lines. Yeah.
Basically that Herbert West served in the Canadian Army during World War I. And that, since Tom is Irish, he had no respect for basically, being the Canadians being British back then.
Okay.
So, I thought that was a very clumsy, esoteric way, to kind of throw in some little tidbit, that I wasn't too. I thought that could have been done a lot better. And
Yeah.
because it's
I
really
guess,
just
I guess when I think I compare it to like the only other full on, like Lovecraft, themed story like this, which would be Alan Moore and Providence, that was spaced out over 12 issues and took its time and never really felt like he was tripping over his own feet trying to get all these references and bits of minutia and that type of thing in there. And so I think that's kind of the advantage that had over, as far as that it was stretched out over more issues, and then didn't feel forced the way that the last couple of issues of Miskatonic felt.
Yeah, Providence was a well done, like almost like chess piece. That everything kind of like served a purpose, and that that eventually you'll figure things out if you don't quite understand what's going on, and like sometimes things were just throwing kind of like a little bit of detail that weren't necessarily really important to the story, but would add something if you knew what it meant. But
Right.
it wasn't like it's not like the I'm the war hero comment that they did. That I don't know why it had to be done that way. And I guess for our audience, do you care to recap of what's been going on in Miskatonic, Richard? Give away some little spoilers for people. So if you don't want to know what's happening, you may want to
Well, yeah, I think we've almost talked too much about it for people who are wanting to read it. Like the basic premise of it almost is kind of a pastiche of like the X-Files, where you've got a Mulder and Scully investigative duo looking into some bombings at Miskatonic University, and as a result, all these various elements of Lovecraft lore come out of the woodwork in terms of who's a suspect and what's going on, and suspect and characters and witnesses that they encounter, that kind of thing. So you'll see elements of things like Dagon and Herbert West and Wilbur Watley and that type of thing, all in the space of just like the first 3 issues. So it's very, very Cthulhu reference heavy, but more, again, kind of like a investigative, because they're both characters are FBI agents, aren't they? As far as
well, I think Tom's kind of like he's like a special agent. He's not really like been sworn in by the FBI, but
they're not partners. They were pushed together to go do this investigation together by Hoover.
Yeah, and the Miranda, she's basically kind of blackmailed herself to stay on in the FBI because she's like the lone FBI agent, to stay when Hoover is doing his purging, and so she goes there and basically kind of like sends her off to like this, almost like this really bad assignment for her, I guess, like kind of get her out of the way. And but it was but I really liked the first issue. I thought that was probably the best that they've done. The second issue, they kind of like they went off the rails for that one, and like kind of like got slightly a little bit back on by the third one.
Right.
But
it would be helpful to know how many issues that this is going to be, so you kind of get a feel for how you're going to pace it. Because I would definitely say at this point, that again, Alan Moore's Providence being the superior version of doing this kind of thing, just because of the fact that he was able to kind of very much take its time and never really felt rushed or anything along those lines.
And it seems to set like almost like an alternate reality of Cthulhu stories and Lovecraft stories, because some of the characters who died are alive, and some characters who are alive are dead. And it seemed like they just decided to just kind of take the characters that he liked and do some with them, and whatever outcome they had in their own individual stories, he kind of ignored. He kind of just took it, and which I really liked that. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to do. Don't have to worry about like shoehorning, trying to figure out now how am I going to figure out how they lived through this.
Right.
He doesn't give any explanation of like why Herbert West is still alive, even though we kind of got the implication at the end of his story that he's dead.
True.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to pick these up and read them, obviously, because I'm definitely out of the loop on this title.
Have you read Providence, the Alan Moore maxi series, the 12-issue series? It's very
I
much
have a couple of issues of it, but I haven't read them. I'd like to pick them up. I wonder if they're on Hoopla. I'll check that out.
They might be.
Yeah,
I haven't looked for that one, but Providence is really good. There was a Neonomicon is kind of a prequel to that story, and it'd be helpful to read that a little bit. And there's also another one called Courtyard, and those are kind of like prequels to the Providence story.
Yeah, he got really into Lovecraft for a while there.
Yeah.
Yeah, those two stories will kind of help you just a little bit with the kind of following events that are going on in the Providence, especially towards the end. That is yeah, but yeah, Miss Matonic is kind of like, it's set in the I think it was the 20s,
Mhm.
and then it's basically kind of like an X-Files type story, but dealing with like Lovecraftian type monsters.
Okay. I
And,
may have. Maybe I even read. Maybe I have the first issue and read it. I'm not sure. That sounds familiar now that you say that. So.
but anyway. Dave Richard, have you heard about the British scientist Monica Grady, who was interviewed? She was a she was a professor of planetary and space science and chancellor at Liverpool Hope University, and she was asked to theorize about life being on Europa, the moon on Jupiter, and she said that they might possess an intelligence of an octopus, which led to headlines such as "Octopus-like creatures inhabited Jupiter's moon." And I also came across another article talking about a paper published in the Progress of Biophysics and Molecular Biology journal suggests that the flourishing of life during the Cambrian era originated from the stars and could be octopus-like. So basically, they were saying that, that octopus-like creatures, came from outer space and landed on our planet. And so my question is, does that mean we're one step closer to proving the existence of Cthulhu?
Yeah, these are his spawn, perhaps.
I've actually read something along those lines. I don't think it was that article, but speculation that an octopus is. I mean, they are kind of an alien. They're completely different from pretty much anything else, and they're obviously highly intelligent.
And they have a lot of good gardens, from what I've heard.
Okay. Have you seen the video where the octopus like finds a coconut and breaks it in half, and then he takes it and he like wraps it up and he pulls it around himself and makes it into like a little shell, a little home, and things float by and he grabs them. so I mean, they make tools anyway.
And I had read something, where they'll attack, other aquatic life out of spite, not even just as far as for, trying to, out of the need for hunger or whatever, but just out of having a bad attitude.
Yeah.
There was a
which indicates somewhat more intelligence than, something that would only, act out of self-preservation or hunger.
Right.
There was I think it was a documentary on Netflix about this guy who followed this one octopus. Somehow this one octopus became like his friend while he was like, doing like underwater diving. So he started filming it and everything. He basically kind of like, covered it for most of his lifespan. Because I think he did record like it's when it's dying days as well. And I can't remember the name of it.
I've seen that. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the documentary, but I've heard about it, and I think ran across it just a day or two ago, and I thought it would be something really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I've been aiming to see it, but there's too much stuff out there streaming right now that I always get distracted by other stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and all that, and now but do you think this proves Cthulhu? Do you think that all this stuff about could there be a Cthulhu?
Well, I don't know, because as far as you get in, we're just getting into tentacled creatures. Does that necessarily equal Cthulhu or equal Lovecraftian in terms of?
Is it really tentacles or is it pseudopods?
Oh yeah, let's get specific about it.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe.
It's like, is a satellite going to go to Pluto, and actually find, the fungi from Yawgoth there? It's like
possibly.
If so,
that's stage 2.
Was tapped into some kind of weird collective unconscious.
Well, that's going back to Providence. That's kind of basically the overall theme, that they had of that story. That Lovecraft had tapped into something. He was basically the prophet, for this new mindset that was going to like hit the world. That basically Call of Cthulhu was almost like a prophecy.
Well, and I did. I would have to go back and remember and figure out where I read this, but it was just yesterday. I was reading an article about how, in geologic terms, there could have been a complete, a modern type civilization before we ever got here, and it would be so old and so ground up in the in history that it's just gone. We wouldn't even be able to find anything other than maybe I don't know, mineral deposits, or if they use certain certain chemicals, maybe they would have been in a thicker or heavier in some areas. But it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's seen what I've seen before as far as some of the theories about Atlantis. Yeah, it was again the more advanced civilization that befell some type of horrible catastrophe, but it was so long ago. There's really nothing left really to prove that they were ever there.
And I guess that's why it explains that nobody can find it because nobody can agree where it is.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And we actually got a question in the email. Hello, I was recently made aware that the Church of Subgenius recognizes Cthulhu as a god. Do you think Cthulhu embodies typical subgenius characteristics, specifically slack? And what do you think Lovecraft would have thought of this recognition? Yours truly, King.
God. I wonder who sent that. I'll pass.
Yes.
I'm curious as to the crossover there as far as how who made the decision to within the Church of the Subgenius to recognize Cthulhu as one of their deities, because I'm not sure as far as he'd necessarily be one of the entity that I would say is again possessed of a lot of slack.
Yeah, I don't see Cthulhu as a slacker, and I definitely don't.
I'd want to see the background on this as far as the logic that went into this decision.
Yes, that does seem it does seem a little bit, unless the subgenius just want to be like iconoclast, to say, that
Right.
They just want to be contrary. It's like we're gonna make Cthulhu, because like.
Right.
Because,
Well, there may be as far as be able to back up their hypothesis with references and that type of thing, and be just interested to see as far as the thinking that went into that.
Yes, well, maybe we'll look that up for the next episode, and
Sounds
do
like
more
a plan.
digging and find out it's like the exact requirements that they decided to name Cthulhu as a god.
The committee that approved this.
Yes, what conclave decided this? It's like, do they burn their smoke in the chimney to dignify this and all that?
As everyone waited to make sure it was official.
Yes, what makes Cthulhu a subgenius god and all that. So in case y'all have any other questions, listeners out there, or want to add your input to the subgenius or anything else we've remarked today, you can contact me at mark@lovecraftpod.com. You can contact the others through there also, like Richard at lovecraftpod.com or David at lovecraftpod.com. You can contact us through one of those ways and submit your question, response, and everything and whatnot. And we still got a few minutes left. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I did run across this. It was a Tumblr blog called Liquid Somnia. It's this list of Lovecraftian cocktails. The traditional Azathoth is, the description of it is: slowly the ice water drips upon the sugar cube, falling bit by bit into the absinthe below until the anticipation drives you insane. So, there's several of them. I won't go through any more. There's one titled "The Grand Legati," and the Third Wisdom
Nice.
Blood Orange Cosmo. There's a lot of interest. Maybe we need to.
Is that where the meme about the beached Cthulhu sour came from? Is that because I saw and it was done up like in the style of like a mixed drink ad type of thing with a tentacle wrapped around it and that type of thing, and telling you specifically what the ingredients were. But it was done more in a straight style of how you would actually prepare it, as opposed to more of mix one part existential dread and
Right. Well, these are actually, most of these have ingredients like Stoli vodka, black currant liquor, and orange juice.
Okay.
That's the From Kadath with Madness drink.
Nice.
So anyway, I mean, maybe we should have one of these on hand each week, and we all try it and say, hey, is this good? Is it bad? Is it
whatever. We'll be able to give reviews of whether how good these are.
We'd have to probably get permission from this guy's website, but who knows? It would be fun though, interesting.
Yeah, we have a tasting going on to see, how these are, in
Right.
the pursuit of intellectual discussion, purely.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. And nothing else.
Right.
Yes, I think that would work. I think that would work well. Anything else y'all want to say?
Don't forget to give us a like or a review on iTunes or any of your other favorite podcast apps.
Yes. The more we have, the better our confidence gets. Yeah. Where's Princess Cthulhu? I haven't seen her in a while.
I hope she's still taking a nap.
Okay.
She was slumbering. I'll put it that way.
Yes, slumbering. Yes. Do not wake up, Princess Cthulhu.
Yeah.
I see the stars are no longer right. We must cease all discussions until they align again next month. 30 Minutes of H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by an online petition to have Lovecraftian in the dictionary. This podcast was created in association with the LovecraftPod.com and the Logan Speculative Fiction Group with the help of the Logan County Public Library, the Lovecraft Eternal Facebook page, the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast, and the Great Old One. Special thanks to Katie Tyson and Joshua Dukes for their assistance. Until we meet again, may you avoid the wrath of Princess Cthulhu, who is not so blind.